Grandfather was one of 7 children, all buried up in Lakeview Cemetery, and he was a middle child, and he'd had only a 3rd grade education, formal education, but of course a whale of a education on the farm. And it was, America was the land of opportunity. In fact, when the first time I went over there, and he used to talk about going to the farm, and I saw the farm, and then talk about going to church. And the church was 2 miles away, and you walk through a pathway in the woods. Imagine doing it in the middle of winter. And you went to church twice. Once in the morning for a 2.5-hour service.
All in Swedish.
All in Swedish, of course. Well, he didn't speak any English when he came over. And so I go over to the church, and they have a little tiny church, but they have these poles on the wall with boxing gloves on the end, where the ushers poke you if you start to doze.
Very good thing now.
Like they did in New England.
Yeah.
And then you went back to church for a Vesper service in the early evening. So geez, 2.5 miles down, 2.5 miles back.
Oh, man.
But having said so, I mean, this was an opportunity. So I had understood that the churches kept very good records, and it happened that they had quite a young preacher who spoke very good English, had some of his training in England, and it was a part-time job. He was a farmer, a part-time job for him. Oh, he said, about when did your grandfather leave here? And we figured that out, and he goes to a log book and opened it up, and there he is, Frank Olaus Anderson, gone to America, Amerika. Entry in the books, and he left. He left on foot from the farm.
The farm was located where again?
The farm was located in a little town called Dostarp in Småland in southern Sweden, and it was probably 100 miles from the nearest seaport. Now he got rides, people's, carts, but I mean that's how he left. And when he got to New York, here's a guy who can't speak a word of English. He had one relative in the United States who was a first cousin that he'd never met, who was in Minneapolis. He had about $50 in his pocket. And New York was a dangerous place then. I mean, they'd knock you down and steal the $50 if they knew you had it.
Mm-hmm.
And so he left New York. He didn't have enough money to buy a train ticket or anything like that. So he left New York to go to Minneapolis on foot. Going to walk. And Jamestown was a stopping place for him because it was well known in Sweden that there was already quite a lot of Swedes here. So what he did is he worked his way from farm to farm. He'd knock on the farm door, and he was a good-looking, hard-working, well-trained guy, so he'd get a job. He'd get his clothes fixed, and he'd get fed, and a few more bucks cash in his pocket, and he'd start west again. Now the rumor, well, he was 18 years old. It sometimes he got driven off the farm because he was screwing around with the farmer's daughter.
Handsome young man.
Yeah, well, yeah, so what do you expect? But he got here. He got a job in the Norquist, what was then the Norquist Furniture Factory. And he married the boss's daughter. And so that's that's how all of that happened. So he never got to Minneapolis at that time.
Now,
But anyway, Rehnquist was I was telling him much of that story.
Yeah.
And he said, "Boy, that's very similar." I mean, his parents came from the same part of Sweden that my grandfather did. And so we had. Then the conversation ended because he had to get up in the head table. But I mean, it was a very interesting conversation, and I'll kind of cherish that.
Terrific.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And he was a very humble guy. Rehnquist was. He was low key and quiet, but he was really mainly interested in how did the Swedes really get here in the first place, and why did they pick this particular spot, etc. But that's
Great experience.
Yeah. But anyway, come back to Jackson. I got to think about it. he moved to Washington around 34, 35, right in there. And I was born in 1930. But the interconnect there. I mean, I do remember him just, as a child, because I saw him after that too, when he'd come back and visit, and et cetera. But his close friend, was George Niebank Sr.
Oh, sure.
And George Niebank Sr. was Uncle George and Aunt Rose to me. I mean, they were my parents' very closest friends, because my dad was on the board of the old Bank of Jamestown and on the board of one of the two banks that they put together there that failed. The bank holiday came, and George Niebank was a young bank examiner from Niagara Falls at that time, and sent in here to work on the Jamestown problems. And what are we going to figure out, and what are we going to do? And that particular thing, they put together that bank and raised a little more capital. I imagine it was very difficult to raise any, because who had any?
Sure.
But they raised a little bit more. And I'm not sure my dad, I know my dad was very much involved, but he was an original director of what became the Bank of Jamestown, and they hired George Niebank to be the CEO of the new combined bank. And so my dad and Niebank became, and Jackson was also a director, and he was also attorney for the bank, for the combined bank, and he was the attorney, I believe, for making it all happen, whatever he had to do with the regulatory folks.
We have some letters to that effect.
Yeah, I mean, so he played that role. In fact, he continued to be a director of the bank even after he went to Washington for a while. I think he stayed on the board of the telephone company too. So he was back and forth, is what I remember. And I come back to the Niebank. So my dad and George Niebank became very close friends, and it was like one of those things like like our kids we grew up with the Cadwells, see, and our kids all together and back and forth on holidays, and they had some interesting habits, because I can remember it so well. Of course, George Niebank died relatively young, I'm going to say. I can't remember what.
Early 50s, I think.
I think he was in his early 50s.
Yeah.
But having said so, Uncle George and Aunt Rose would always come, and the kids would come to our house. We lived on 5th Street, not far from the Presbyterian Church. The house that we had, Marty Carnahan had for many, many years. And my grandfather's house was right behind on 4th Street. But anyway, they'd come and call after church on Christmas Day, around noontime, and Uncle George would always bring my father a bottle of scotch, a really good bottle of scotch, all wrapped up like that. See? And then traditionally, at, let's say 5 in the afternoon, we go over and call on them. And all the family had to go, whoever was around. And my father would bring Uncle George a bottle of scotch. Well, it was the same bottle. It went back and never got drunk. I got a kick out of that. Isn't that some? So, but anyway, George Niebank particularly became then very close to Bob Jackson because of the whole history of putting that bank together and sort of creating a job for him, and he moved to Jamestown and et cetera. So they were very, very close. And that's really, in a sense, how George Jr. got to be his clerk. Not that he wasn't capable, that wasn't the point, but they were very, very close. You do the same thing for, somebody's son who you were that close with. So what I was saying, when he would come back, I can remember him being in our house, Jackson, and but I can't remember him as being much fun, very, very intense and very bright, clearly, but kind of strict. It's, children were meant to be seen but not heard, and that sort of thing. And George Niebank was very much the same way. I mean, that's just the way they were. But when the Jackson finally really moved, sold his place in Jamestown, really became part of the Washington scene, going to be permanent, not just another client sort of thing. I can remember one conversation. Maybe I was a little bit old, 7 or 8, or whatever, but I was old enough to remember this. I remember my father, whoever he was talking to at that time, said, "Well, that guy's a traitor. He's gone and cast his lot with the enemy."
That being Roosevelt?
Being Roosevelt and Company. Because Roosevelt and Company, were driving the poor manufacturing type businessmen nuts.
Right.
I mean, I was thinking about it, Greg, just recently, because my father, till he died, would not celebrate Labor Day. He put a coat and tie on and go to work. And when I was working for him, he'd call a management, a kind of a long-range planning meeting, and we'd be down there all day long, full dress, coat and tie, when everybody else was on holiday. Because he said, well, you see, what happened is business in the 30s was terrible. And it was a real struggle to meet payroll and to even stay alive and to stay in business. And along comes Roosevelt and promoted this federally required paid holiday on top of everything else you had to do, and recognizing unions and so forth. And it was a payoff, a reward to the unions for their support. That's really what it was. And my dad said, "I'll be goddamned if I'm going to celebrate Labor Day." I said, "If they have a management day someday, I'll take that day off." But he was forced to provide a paid holiday when he didn't have any money, In those days, I can remember it, he was going down to the post office on Thursday morning to see if enough checks came in to meet the payroll. So it was a real struggle. One more paid holiday was not something that he appreciated. So, in that sense, you see, that's...
Did your dad start Dahlstrom's?
No. That's an interesting thing. In fact, I was my day yesterday. I was out at a company in Cincinnati that was founded in 1842, and it was the Verdon Company, and the 3 Verdon men that I was talking to are the 5th generation in that company.
I'll be darned.
There are very few of those. One of the oldest privately owned companies in the country. And the reason I'm out there is they make church bells, and it has to do with this church that I'm working on in Florida.
Right.
But I was telling them a story. My father had one sister. My grandfather ultimately started his own furniture company, and I tell people that if I were 35 instead of 75, I'd be in New Orleans right now, figuring out what I could make for them. I wouldn't be cleaning up the rubbish. I'd be figuring out what I could manufacture.
Right.
In 1906, when San Francisco had the earthquake and the fire and everything that went with it, my grandfather had a furniture. There were roughly 100 furniture companies in Chautauqua County, but many of them had a dozen employees. I mean, rather small. A garage with a few guys in it. But anyway, he got on the train, went to San Francisco, and figured that, geez, they're going to need a lot of furniture. Everything got destroyed, and he came back with enough work to fill his plant for 2 years. In fact, he got written up in the New York Times way back then, because people just didn't do that. I mean, the only people who went on the train to California were Rockefellers or some, very wealthy people. And he just figured that was a good business opportunity. And he was probably 35. Well, that was incredible. But anyway, he developed quite a prosperous company, and he had once. My father had a sister. My father went to Andover and MIT and was a hard-working, straight arrow kind of a guy. Maybe a little dull in some ways because he didn't have as much fun as some of us have had. But so be it. But his sister, my aunt, married a guy from Minneapolis that she met on a trip to Europe on a boat, and he was a playboy. And he was a lot more fun than my dad was to us kids.
Sure.
Yeah, but he was, he just didn't produce, and my aunt, we lived right next door to each other, and my grandfather right behind him, and house that he built the houses, and she thought her husband should get paid about the same as my dad and have equal status and all that stuff. And so they didn't get along at all. And I know more about it now than I did then, but that was the case. So one day my dad called the two of them in. My grandfather called my dad and my Uncle Alvin into his office and said, "I've solved the problem. I sold the business." Done. So my dad, this was about early 30s sometime, and my dad set up an office down at in the Hotel Jamestown, which my grandfather had built. And what he was doing was there were lots of companies in trouble, and he was a well-known, experienced businessman. And would you come down and look at this place? Banks a lot of times he'd be hired by a bank.
Right.
Go look at the situation, and what do? We foreclose on this loan and liquidate them and just get out the best we can, or we feed them a little more and keep them going, or that was the kind of stuff he was doing. And the Dahlstrom Company was pretty big at that time. It was probably in the 30s, had 500 employees. But they were in serious financial trouble because a lot of their work was architectural work on big buildings where the contractor or the builder went bankrupt. I mean, it was a mess, and so they weren't getting paid, and it wasn't the kind of thing you could sell the product to somebody else, because it was made especially for that job. But he recognized an opportunity there, and was able to raise a little money from some people that had it. Example, Dr. Blaisdell, had Blaisdell, a successful surgeon. He had money in the Depression, where other people didn't, and so and he was very close buddy of my dad's, and he put money into it. Some of those kinds of people. I think what he raised was a pittance, really, what they needed, but it was a show willing.
Sure.
And the banks, decided to go along with him. But it was a real struggle over the rest of the 30s. And then during World War II, they had tons of work because they had the metalworking ability to make stuff. And they got, money to buy machinery from the government, but you couldn't really make and keep a profit because they had excess profits. Your taxes were based on what your profits were pre-war, and they didn't have any. Right. So they virtually confiscated anything you really made at the bottom line. So it was a struggle, but until right after the war. Right after the war, for about the first 10 years after the war, it was bonanza for companies like that because if you had the skilled labor and you had the equipment and you had the factories, plenty of work to do. But so he didn't own it. He was when he died, he was probably 10% shareholder.
When did you get involved?
Well, I got involved this way. Of course, I was, it was a great struggle with my parents. We had six boys. I had one brother who died at age 10 or 12 from spinal meningitis, but the rest of us all, but he put us all through boarding school and college and graduate school, if you wanted it, and paid for it, and never had he said, I'll do that, and spending money's on you, but graduated, without a penny of debt, and a superb education, but of course in those days you had to go right in the service. So I then spent 4.5 years in the Navy. And the way things worked then, you had job interviews. I had them both at Princeton and at MIT in graduate school, because they wanted, even though you had to go in the service, they wanted to get you on their target list if they wanted you. That's the only way they could get people. So, and then they would keep writing you every 6 months or so all the time you were in service. Keep in touch, and raise the starting pay as you got older and so on. Well, I had aspiration, big companies, big city, etc., which I could easily do. I mean, I had a splendid offer from Kodak and another one from Bethlehem Steel. I thought, boy, if I could ever get a job with a company like Bethlehem Steel, wouldn't that be Eileen Clover? Sure. What a mistake that would have been. Well, anyway, and of course, I was the younger I was the fifth out of our 6 boys.
That's Quint.
That's where the Quintus comes from. And that comes from my grandfather. I had no name at all. You didn't know in advance in those days what you're going to have. You had no. It was a great surprise when the birth came. Yeah. And I'm sure they wouldn't even bother to try to have another child except for the fact they had 4 boys, and they desperately just sort of wanted a girl to. So certainly after 4 boys, you're going to have a girl, right? Sure. They had girls' clothes and girls, whatever you have, and no plans for a boy whatsoever. And when I arrived, I was a great disappointment. In fact, the story is I had no name at all for about a week. I mean, I was there. See. So as my grandfather came up with the Quintus. And that was a middle name. My first name is Raymond, and quickly it was intended that I was going to be called Raymond, except that probably growing up I knew 5 or 6 Ray Andersons. Mm-hmm. So that's how they began using the Quintus.
Yeah, I'm not sure, right until you just mentioned it, I would never have been able to answer that question.
What's that?
What the R Quintus meant?
Yeah. People call me when I go into a doctor's office or someplace like that, and Raymond, they call out the name, and I don't even turn around. See, I'm not used to it. I got it in the service quite a bit, right. But that's the only place. But anyway, I spent 4.5 years in the service. I extended. I was obligated for. It was about a half a year going to OCS and getting my commission, and then was obligated for 3 years, and then I was in a job that I liked and I was really needed, and it was fascinating. It was an engineering type job. I had an aeronautical engineering designation, and what I was doing is I was the troubleshooter for the catapults and arresting gear of the fleet of aircraft carriers. And we were converting the fleet to the steam catapult, which was a design we bought from the British, or the British gave us or something, but it wasn't working. And I was stationed at the outfit that manufactured these things and did the engineering on them and so on. And what my job began to develop is these things were complicated, and the shipboard personnel if they had a breakdown, couldn't fix them. You had to send technicians from the factory out there. And so what they trained me to do is I could diagnose the problem. And wherever there was a breakdown in the world, the Indian Ocean or the Mediterranean or off the coast of Africa or wherever it was, they'd fly me out there. And usually I'd land on the carrier. And I'd fly commercially to some nearby place and then get picked up by a military plane and land on the carrier, and I diagnosed the problem. I couldn't physically fix it myself, but I could figure out what they needed, and then send that information back to headquarters. And then they'd send out the right people and the right equipment to get the job done. But there were times when we had, we had carriers out there with both catapults shut down. I mean, and a carrier's a dead duck in the sea if they can't get his airplanes up.
Right.
I mean, I had top secret clearance, and we were dealing with a national security issue. It was kind of interesting.
What was the time frame here?
This was 54, 55. But it was interesting. So that's how I got to be the international flavor. I mean, I got sent to Japan and India and Sri Lanka, all over the place. It wasn't any place I didn't get to. And in fact, they wanted to transfer me. I worked for a guy, commanding officer of this place. This Naval Air Material Center in Philadelphia. It sits on the Navy Yard, but it's a different command. And my commanding officer, who later became a top admiral, who was a Naval Academy graduate, was a hell of a guy. And I got to, the guy who was really on the hot seat was the admiral who was the chief of naval operations, the CNO, the big military shot. And he wanted me to come to, he used to call me up because he was on the hot seat, from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We got our carriers out here. We're fix them, get something going. So he wanted to transfer me down to Washington, from Philadelphia, so I could be closer to the epicenter. And not that, I wasn't so damn important, but I was the guy with the knowledge.
Sure.
And I was just a kid. And my commanding officer in Philadelphia didn't think that was a good idea. Were you in the service?
No.
Okay, well, I'll tell you how it works. So he persuaded, and he was a close friend of the chief of naval operations. He persuaded him to give me temporary duty in Washington. So for a while, I spent a couple days a week in Philadelphia, a couple 3 days a week in Washington. Well, the way things work in the military, if you're writing a letter from one command to another command, you write it from the commanding officer, so-and-so command, to the commanding officer, and then you sign it, Gregory Peterson, by direction.
Right.
That's the way that protocol works. Well, I'd write these letters requesting permission to do so-and-so, and then I go down to Washington, and the letters were sitting on my desk, and I replied to them for the admirals.
But you were writing yours yourself?
Yeah, he's exactly right. I did that for about a year. That was yeah, I messed something. Oh, geez, it was all legitimate stuff. But that was something interesting. But anyway, coming back to Jackson, my recollections really are rather vague. But I do recall him. Especially after he was in Washington, not when he was in the Supreme Court. I don't think that ever happened later, but for a few years there, he'd be up here quite frequently because he had these board meetings to go to and so on, and there'd be some kind of family weekend affair, either at the Niebanks or the Andersons or the Sportsman's Club.
You go to the Sportsman's Club while he was... When he came back up here, he was still a member? I know he was a member, but
yeah.
Did he keep his membership?
Well, we would do one of those Sunday things. We did more of that now that back then than we do now, where families would be up there. And of course, another one that he stuck with was the Union Club. You familiar with that? Well, that's think of Union League in New York. This is the Union Club, which is defunct, long since defunct. But in the hotel, Jamestown, they built up on the mezzanine on the second floor a kind of a private club place for the the real movers and shakers of town, and it was something that nobody was supposed to know about.
Right.
And they'd go up, and the unions thought that these guys would get together and sort of agree on what they were and weren't going to do in the next round of negotiation, that kind of stuff, see, which they didn't.
So the union club, it was called really, it was a management group.
It was a management group, but it had nothing to do with that kind of union. It was a union of like-thinking people, see.
Yeah.
And it later on became kind of a social party kind of a thing, but for in its earlier days, these guys, when they could do it, that's where they went and had lunch.
Right.
And they'd play cards, but that's where they sort of talked about what's going on around town. And Jackson was part of that.
I've never heard of this.
Yeah. And he stayed with it. And that group, they decided not to add people as people died, and so it eventually kind of petered out, is what happened.
Sort of a last man's club.
Yeah, it kind of petered out. They couldn't agree on who to add.
Now your dad was part of that.
Oh yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
And Niebank and all those guys, the guys that were really doing stuff.
Well, Jackson, talk about the politics here for a second, being very Democrat. He had to be one of the few a part of that club.
Absolutely. But he was very much as an advisor involved in the business side of things. Mm-hmm. And especially anything that had to do with regulatory stuff, I guess. I mean, he liked that.
What do you think it was about Jackson that was able to basically cross that line when most people could not? Very ardent Democrat, but he became very much a consultant to Republican.
Well, I think part of it is, I sense, I'm stale on it now, but reading his biography and so forth, it reminded me of a lot of things, but I sense that he was very upfront and forward and predictably honest about it, so he didn't, we have a few liberal friends I'm thinking of. I've got one college friend, a classmate of mine in college who's in Vero Beach, Florida with us. I frankly don't like to go out for dinner with him anymore because he's an anti-George Bush, which I don't mind but you can't say anything without him going to pieces and making a big deal and a big lecture out of it. I don't think Jackson was that type.
No.
He had a gentleman's disagreement on what should be done. You see, he was a little bit more like Henry Ford. See, when Henry Ford doubled the wages of the blue-collar workers in his factories, doubled them overnight, why the other businessmen thought he was either nuts or a communist or he was dreadful. But he had the sense that was the thing to do so that they could afford to buy the products he was making. See? It was quite a different idea. You can imagine how a guy like John D. Rockefeller felt about that. See? He wanted to pay people as little as possible in order to make profits as much as possible.
Okay.
You see the difference?
Absolutely.
And Jackson had some of that. I don't know that Jackson, I never got the impression that he was super hipped on the entitlement side of the New Deal, but on the empowerment side he was. That these guys in the factory should have crazy as loony as they might be, should have the power to express their thoughts and to negotiate a position, and they ought to at least have a minimum wage and things like that, which he felt was good for the country as a whole. I think that was an honest disagreement. I think some of put it the other way, some of the conservatives are blind to that.
Did you get a sense when the Nuremberg trials were going on that that was being followed much back here in Jamestown?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. But of course, you didn't follow things the same way you do now.
Right.
I mean, just think if they'd had the television.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. That was a big deal. And I do get that sense. And I was old enough to know that. And it was, seemed to be well covered in the newspapers. And there's a great deal of local pride that a local guy was in the international spotlight.
But just as an aside, this past summer we had 2 interns at the Jackson Center, and we sent them off to the microfilm at the Prendergast Library to do exactly that.
Is that right?
How was he
And
covered?
what did they find?
A lot. And
I mean, my recollection, my sense is that,
and meeting with Christy Herbst next week, and our hope is to take that product, and she puts it in a book form, and we present it during this year.
Well, that's interesting, sure.
And Robert Jackson through the eyes of the Jamestown Post-Journal.
Mm-hmm.
Or the Nuremberg trial through the eyes of the Jamestown Post-Journal. So that they're excited about doing something like that.
Well, of course, Jamestown is a small place, but you try to explain to other people. I mean, any lawyer you talk to knows the name Jackson for sure, and lots of other educated people would.
Sure.
That would mean something. Now, a lot more people know Lucille Ball, but that's all right.
Mm-hmm.
It amuses me, that Jim Barry tells me the statistics that little Lucille Ball place gets way more visitors than Roger Torrey.
Oh, when I'm downtown, I can't believe.
I mean, unbelievable.
Oh, and they come from all
And yet Roger Torrey is, amazing. I mean, it become quite an attraction.
Right.
I was down there one day this summer. That's what I was doing, was picking up in their shop an osprey for keep the birds off the dock.
Mm-hmm.
Because a windstorm had taken mine away. In fact, I got Jim to carry those because they are, if you need them, they're very successful.
Right.
Well, this was while that Swedish Scandinavian festival was going on at JCC.
Right.
And there was an older couple there and nobody else, late Saturday afternoon, looking over the stuff in the shop. So I introduced myself and spoke. Well, they came from Sweden. And they were here on holiday, and this guy was a retired professor from Uppsala University, and just a history professor, but he was a birder, and he knew Roger Torrey Peterson's name. In fact, he was present, he said, when he was involved in whatever the bird organization would be over there, when Roger would go halfway across the world to get a medal or an award. He would, he was present in Stockholm when the king gave him this special gold medal, whatever he got. I forget what the award was. And he said I didn't even get to meet him because there were so many people there, but he was. So when he got to Jamestown, he didn't even know the Swedish festival was going on. But part of their trip was to come by and see this Roger Torrey Peterson Institute. And, well, I thought so they had walked. In fact, they were on a tour. They were at a bus tour. They were staying at the Holiday Inn. And this couple had walked from JCC over to RPTI because they wanted to see the place.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite a walk. And it was a hot August day.
Yeah.
So I gave him a ride back to the festival and got talking with him. But just the Institute was known to them in Sweden, which I think is terrific.
Exactly.
So for a little town, we've produced some interesting characters.
Yeah, absolutely.
In entirely different fields.
Exactly. And it's interesting. There's such a wonderful overlap there. And one of the things the county has finally grabbed onto is what they call cultural tourism. Where people, in fact, will come to follow up on the Roger Torrey Peterson.
Sure.
Jacksons and the Sioux.
But you know, we're not unique in the sense that compared to my younger days, we've lost a tremendous amount of our manufacturing base. However, the employment scene, the unemployment scene, is no worse than it ever was. In fact, it's reasonably close to the national average, I guess. Meaning that people are employed in other things, service businesses, and that's not all bad.
That's right. Can you just go back a little bit to your story? You left, ultimately got out of the Navy, and chose to come back here.
My dad, go back to that story. I really was not intending to come back here. I liked it here, but I didn't see the opportunities. And my dad sat me down one time when I was home and said, I know what your aspirations are, and I don't blame you, but, and he said, consider this. He said, the company was doing fine at that time, and he said, I'm going to retire sooner than you think, and you can take over, I'm sure, because we have nobody on staff who has your background, education, etc. In fact, if you're not interested in doing it, I'm going to have to go out and find somebody, because I just can't leave it up in the air. And they didn't have it. They had a fine team that he had of guys his age, but as far as young people that college trained and MBA types, they didn't have anybody.
Right.
And he said, I'll pay you about half what Kodak would pay us. But he said, you'll make up for that eventually, and sort of thing. And by that time, Heidi was born when we were in the Navy. She was born in the Naval Hospital in Philadelphia. It cost me $25 for everything.
Yeah, unbelievable.
And Chris was, Sandy was about 6 months pregnant with Chris. So we're going to soon have 2 children. And we looked at each other and said, this Jamestown, life may be a lot better than we thought. Maybe that's what we ought to do. And we decided to do that. So if it doesn't work, we can always do something else. So what happened then, so I did come to work for him, and actually he died about 5 years later. So I took over as the CEO at age about 30, and it was an Excedrin headache for a while. I had a board that didn't get along together. I had shareholders who thought their sons ought to be in the business instead of me. I had one director who leave unnamed who was past 90 who fell asleep at every meeting. I couldn't get him off the board. And I had nothing but criticism and no help. It was a mess. And we were in a dying business. We had an old plant, multi-story, old machinery. They had a lot of cash in the bank. But the gurus, the Union Club guys, every single one of them, they're running those companies, almost without exception, unless they were run by out-of-town people. Piled cash in the bank during the profitable years of the 50s, thinking there'd be another depression like there was after World War I. And we want to be ready for it. Well, what really happened is that competitors in the sheet metal business built one-story plants with computer-driven machinery, and we didn't have any of that kind of stuff. And we were taking stuff up and down elevators on little push carts, and there's just no way. And then we had a high labor cost because of unions being ingrained for a long time, and et cetera. When things slowed down, we were kind of in left field. But it was very difficult to get the old-timers on the board to recognize the reality of that. So I had to get some venture capital guys in to buy them out, is what I really did, buy out the problems. And also we decided to I made a couple cracks at selling the business, but it was a non-goer because the sophisticated buyers that I was looking at could recognize the problems themselves, and they didn't want to buy something that was sort of waning.
Right.
So with venture capital money, I was able to go out and buy some other businesses, and some of them were real winners and a few were bummers.
Yeah.
But and then was able to spin off the old factory. In fact, I sold the real estate to the county industrial development people who leased it back to it was a management group that I had there. Leased it back to them for $1. Took it off the tax rolls, and that breathed life into that business for another 10 years. That's what it really did. Kept that employment, but it was bound to die eventually.
Right.
Just as Art Bettle did, and just it was bound to happen. And I went through a cycle of I had venture capital money, and eventually was able to get them out and end up owning what I owned myself. But it was an evolution of things. But that's how I got back here in Jamestown. I never regret it. I had the best of all worlds.
Fascinating.
See, I had an apartment and an office, and an apartment in New York and an office in the Seagram's building for a good 25 years. And an airplane to get down there. And I'd basically spend the business 3 days a week at least in New York, and the other 2 days either on the road or here. And I never wanted to move to New York. I mean, I owed money to every one of those banks in Park Avenue.
Right.
In separate deals. I kept these companies as I got further down the road. I kept the companies completely and financially separate. And these bankers would ask me for a consolidated balance sheet or something like that. I didn't have one.
Right.
And I didn't want one.
Right.
And my deals with the banks were, negotiating how much equity I put in and how much debt they'd put in. And that kept me in a good negotiating position, because sometimes the businesses got in trouble. I remember one specifically, I had an automotive parts business in Michigan, and the Bank of Detroit was my lender there, and I owed them about $10 million, and the automotive business was down.
Right.
And you go into a downward spiral, you're not only hit by lower volume, you're hit by lower prices, because everybody's trying to get the available business, so your margins are squeezed in the wrong way.
Right.
So we had a problem. And they call me out there, so I go out and meet. When you get into trouble with a bank, when you put a bank loan on the books, you're dealing with very nice sales type guys. But when you're in trouble, you deal with, I call them the undertakers. And I go out there and meet with this undertaker. He said, "Geez, you're in real trouble out here." And I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, you owe us about $10 million, and there's just you're not making any money. There's no way you can pay it." Oh, I said, "Geez, that's interesting." I said, "I don't think I owe you a dime. It's this corporation that owes you the money." And I said, "Actually, you're in more trouble than I am, because you got more money in there than I do." And I said, "I tell you what, I brought the keys to the plant with me. I put them on the table." I said, "You're welcome to take it over."
Right.
"Oh, no, we don't do that." Well, I said, "Here's what we'll do." I said, "I'll put another $1 million in, which I could do from the group of companies, in as working capital if you'll increase my credit line by $2 million." Oh, he said, "We'd never do that. We're not going to put more money at risk in a bad situation." "That was your choice."
Right.
I said, "But I don't think we have anything more to discuss." So I left and got on the plane, flew back to Jamestown. By the time I got back, there was a phone message from his boss saying, "We'll do it. If you can have your $1 million out here tomorrow," or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, see, got myself in a negotiating position.
Yes, sir.
I began to recognize these banks are nothing to be afraid of. They're just suppliers.
And sometimes if they get into you enough, they're partners.
They're partners, you see. And this was a cyclical business, and this was a cycle. And we had a pretty good operation,
Sure.
which eventually made money again. But you know, a lot of adventures to go with it. But that's not Jackson. But
Well, it's interesting. This is all about it. And at some point, just in a sidebar, Jackson did some work for Dahlstrom.
oh yes, oh yeah.
And
I don't know what it was, but
pretty in the 1920s or...
yeah.
he
Hey, some yeah, see, Jackson was about, I'm going to say 50. When was Jackson born?
1892.
Yeah, so he's about 10 years older than my dad.
So he was part of at least the legal structure, maybe before,
Yeah.
with Dahlstrom's before your...
May have been in the problems they were going through before
Right.
too. I mean, they almost went under.
Mhm.
You see, again, I say they were entirely architectural metalwork.
Mhm.
Before my dad got in, the metalwork for people like IBM and Kodak came later,
Mhm.
and this architectural stuff was mostly big, monumental, high-rise buildings in the big cities.
Mhm.
I mean, we did Rockefeller Center and the Empire State Building and so on. In more modern times, the Pan Am Building and the World Trade Center, Seagram's Building, Citicorp headquarters. I mean, those kinds of buildings. But
Sure.
those are the kinds of things that got in. I mean, they just came to a dead stop in the Depression
Right.
after the crash, and you could have your money all tied up in stuff that was on the job and plus stuff that was in process in the factory, and you weren't going to get paid. And you know, it was so no wonder the bankers were scratching their head. What do we do? And the local bank had they owed a few million at that time, and the local bank had maybe $1 million of it, but
Mhm.
the main participant was Guarantee Trust in New York.
That's right.
Yeah, but that's the way, and a lot of those things folded. And if you had a management that appeared to be lazy and dishonest, and you know, then the bank would just close them up, because that was their best bet to get anything out of it. But if you had a management that was hardworking and intelligent and doing the best damn job they could, you were better off going along with them.
What's next for Quint Anderson? You've done so much.
Oh, geez. My next thing is my 75th birthday.
Congratulations.
I was born on Thanksgiving Day
Ah, great.
in 1930, and my birthday fell on Thanksgiving once in a while, but we always celebrate it as if it were on Thanksgiving because the kids and the grandchildren and so forth. I mean, that's a plausible weekend for most of them.
Sure.
You get a long weekend out of it if you want to. So this year we have 10 grandchildren, 6 children, their spouses, so they're all coming to Florida over Thanksgiving, and we'll celebrate there. But what's next? I don't know. But finish building this church. Just I'll tell you about yesterday. I went out to Cincinnati. We're putting in a carillon. And I thought we had a carillon at Chautauqua and also at St. Luke's, because they both play tunes. In the professional definition, both of those are chimes.
Okay, I wouldn't have known that.
I wouldn't know that. And this Verdun factory where I went supplied both of those, and they've just recently renovated both of those. There are 14 bells at Chautauqua. There's 10 at St. Luke's. This thing we're doing in Florida, for whatever reason, is 32 bells, which is 4 octaves is what it is. And this company, the Verdun company, was founded in 1842. And the Verdun boys, they're Verdun men that I was meeting with, 3 of them are actually first cousins of each other. and they're the 5th generation, and all 3 of them have sons in the business. Now that's very unusual, isn't it?
Extremely.
And they took me over in a park in Cincinnati to show me a bell they made that was the largest bell in the world. Weighs 60,000 pounds. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And the only reason they made it is that the donor, who was a Cincinnati guy who had a lot of money, wanted to give the largest bell in the world, and it was an attraction. But it was a very interesting thing. I know a lot more about bells now than I ever thought. So anyway, finishing up this church, and it's almost done, and also involved in the expansion of our theater down there, which is just getting under construction. Now we've raised the money, most of it. So I seem to have a succession of projects at that time.
Good for you. You know, you've really done so much for so many people, and you to be complimented the family.
Well,
it's a real credit to you guys.
but I think I was brought up that way. That you besides going out and making a living, you got to do something that benefits the community, and you get a lot of satisfaction out of that.
Sure.
And I've been fortunate. Now, so the real secret is if you can keep your health and keep the brain going.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to share some thoughts. And